This isn't just a story I'm telling. It's something I had to live through, piece by painful piece. Looking back, I can still feel the heat from the oven and the ice in my husband's voice. The weight of my grandmother's cast iron skillet felt heavier than usual in my hands as I set it on the trivet in the center of our dining room table. Steam, rich with the scent of rosemary and garlic, curled up towards the ceiling of our pristine Naperville home. My husband Mark and his sister Karen were gathered for our monthly family dinner, and I watched as Karen's perfectly glossed lips curled into a faint, disdainful smile. She picked up her wine glass, swirling the deep red liquid, and said, loud enough for God and everyone to hear, "It's just so rustic, Amelia. All this effort for a chicken. Don't you ever get tired of playing house?" Before I could even form a reply, Mark chuckled beside her, a hollow, grating sound. "Honey, Karen's just saying what we all think. This is a nice little hobby, but it doesn't exactly pay the mortgage, does it?" He reached over and patted my hand, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate but felt like a dismissal. And that's when his sister delivered the final blow, looking right through me as if I were a ghost in my own home. "Honestly, Mark, I don't know how you do it. All that ambition, saddled with someone so fundamentally useless. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows." The word hung in the air. Uglier than any four-letter word I could imagine. Useless. It landed with a thud, right next to the roasted chicken I had spent 3 hours brining and seasoning. I looked from Karen's smug, triumphant face to my husband's, expecting, no, begging for him to defend me. To say something, anything. Instead, he just gave a weak, uncomfortable shrug and took a large gulp of his wine. "Karen, come on," he mumbled, his eyes refusing to meet mine. That was it. That was his grand defense of his wife. In that moment, the silence from my husband was louder and more damaging than his sister's cruelty. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had built my entire life around this man, this home. I managed our lives, our social calendar, our meals, the very comfort he came home to every single night. I'd given up a promising career in marketing to support his when he got the big promotion at his Chicago law firm. It was a choice we had made together, a sacrifice he had claimed to appreciate. But sitting there, under the warm glow of the chandelier Mark had been so proud of, I had never felt more worthless, more invisible. The beautiful meal, the gleaming silverware, the perfectly set table, it all felt like a stage set for my own public execution. I remember looking down at my hands, calloused from kneading dough and scrubbing pots, and thinking how strange it was that hands so capable could belong to a person deemed so useless. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just served the chicken, my movements stiff and robotic. I watched them eat my food, the food I had lovingly prepared, while they discussed their important careers, their upcoming bonuses, and their plans for a ski trip to Aspen I wasn't invited on. I was just the caterer, the live-in help, a decorative, functionless part of Mark's successful life. As I cleared their plates, Karen stopped me, her hand on my arm. "The chicken was a little dry, by the way," she whispered, a conspiratorial smirk playing on her lips. "Maybe try a cooking class at the community college. They probably have something for beginners." I simply nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Later that night, as I lay in bed next to Mark, the space between us a cold, vast chasm, I stared at the ceiling and listened to his steady, untroubled breathing. He was already asleep, the evening's casual cruelty completely forgotten. But for me, it was a beginning. The insult hadn't just hurt me, it had ignited something deep inside. A cold, hard ember of rage that started to glow in the darkness. They thought I was useless. They thought my passion was a joke. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I made a silent promise to myself right then and there. I would make them choke on that word. I would build an empire out of their insults, and I'd use the very thing they mocked to burn their world to the ground. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. The weeks following that disastrous dinner were a masterclass in passive aggression and quiet suffering. Mark acted as if nothing had happened, a trait of his I once mistook for being easygoing, but now recognized as profound cowardice. He'd kiss my cheek in the morning, ask what was for dinner, and talk about his grueling day at the firm, completely oblivious to the silent war I was waging within myself. Karen would send me links to online secretarial courses and articles titled "Re-entering the Workforce After 40." Always with a breezy note. "Thinking of you, so." It was psychological warfare disguised as family concern. My humiliation festered, turning into a low-grade fever of suspicion. I started paying closer attention. I'd always handled the household budget, but Mark managed our main investment accounts and his own salary deposits. He'd give me a monthly allowance for groceries, house maintenance, and my personal expenses, an arrangement that now felt less like a partnership and more like an employer-employee relationship. I started noticing the little things. He became cagey when his credit card statements arrived, quickly shuffling them into his briefcase. He'd take calls from his financial advisor in his home office with the door shut, something he'd never done before. Before, I trusted him implicitly. Now, trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. The discovery phase began one Tuesday afternoon. Mark had left his laptop open on the kitchen island, having rushed out for a meeting. It was a rare slip-up. For a moment, I hesitated, a wave of guilt washing over me. This felt like a violation. But then Karen's voice echoed in my head, useless, and the guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. I told myself I was just going to close it, but my fingers moved of their own accord, clicking on his email icon. His inbox was mostly work-related junk, but a search for Karen's name brought up a thread from a few weeks ago, right after the dinner. The subject line was, Amelia's little hobby. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read their exchange. Karen had written, You have to do something, Mark. It's embarrassing. People ask what your wife does and you have to say she bakes? You're a partner at one of the top firms in Chicago. It reflects poorly on you. She's draining your resources on organic flour and fancy pots while contributing nothing. Mark's reply was what truly broke me. It wasn't just a weak defense. It was a complete betrayal. I know, Kay, I'm working on it. I've already cut back her monthly allowance, told her the market was down. She didn't even notice. She's so wrapped up in her little kitchen projects, she has no idea what's going on financially. It's probably for the best. Simpler that way? Simpler that way. He was actively deceiving me, managing me, treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted with adult matters. He wasn't just enabling his sister's contempt. He was a co-conspirator. I scrolled further, my stomach twisting into a painful knot. I found spreadsheets he'd shared with her, detailing our finances. My allowance was listed under an expense category he'd labeled household and hobby overheads. It was the cold corporate language that stung the most. I wasn't his partner. I was an overhead, a cost to be managed and minimized. I felt a dizzying wave of nausea and rage. I had sacrificed my career for this man. I had poured my love and energy into creating a sanctuary for him, a beautiful home he was proud to show off to his colleagues. And behind my back, he and his sister were laughing at me, dismissing me, and systematically stripping me of any agency I thought I had. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. The warmth of my kitchen, once my refuge, now felt suffocating. The scent of the sourdough starter I had fermenting on the counter suddenly seemed cloying. Everything I had built my life on, love, trust, partnership, was a lie. He didn't see a partner. He saw an expense. Karen didn't see a sister-in-law. She saw a liability. They had all the power. Mark had the money, the career, the legal knowledge. Karen had the family's respect and a sharp, cruel tongue that could cut anyone down to size. They were a fortress, and I was on the outside with no weapons and no allies. I sank onto a kitchen stool, the sleek, cold granite of the island pressing against my forearms. For a long while, I just sat there, hollowed out. The initial shock gave way to a profound sense of helplessness. What could I do? If I confronted him, he'd deny it, gaslight me, call me hysterical for snooping. He'd turn it around and make it my fault. They would close ranks, and I would be more isolated than ever. The thought of leaving was terrifying. I had no recent work experience, no income of my own, and my name was only on the deed to the house, not on the accounts that held all the real money. They had designed this prison perfectly. But then my eyes landed on a worn, leather-bound book on a shelf by the stove. It was my grandmother's recipe book. Its pages were stained with vanilla, butter, and a century of family history. She had been a formidable woman who raised 5 children through the Depression by selling her pies and bread to the neighborhood. She was anything but useless. I walked over and opened it, my fingers tracing her elegant looping script. A recipe for her never-fail sponge cake was on the page, with a note scribbled in. The margin. The secret isn't the sugar, it's the salt. You need the bitter to appreciate the sweet. a strange calm settled over me. The helplessness began to recede, replaced by a flicker of that same cold fire from the night of the dinner. They saw my passion as a weakness, a frivolous hobby. They were wrong. My kitchen wasn't my prison. It was my laboratory. My love for food wasn't a liability. It was an asset they were too arrogant and blind to understand. They thought they had all the power, but they had forgotten one crucial thing. I knew all their secrets. I knew Mark's favorite meal was the pot roast his mother used to make, a recipe I had perfected. I knew Karen had a secret sweet tooth and a weakness for salted caramel. I knew how to nourish, how to comfort, how to bring people together. And I realized, standing there in the heart of my home, that anyone who knows how to create something from nothing also knows how to tear it all down. They had left me with nothing to lose, which meant I was finally free to fight back. I wasn't just going to get a job. I was going to take the very thing they despised and build a life so successful, so magnificent, that the memory of their condescension would be nothing but a bitter aftertaste. I was going to make my own damn mortgage payments. And I was going to start that very night. My resolve settled not like a storm, but like a quiet, chilling frost. My grief and anger froze into something hard and sharp. A plan. I couldn't fight them on their turf. The courtroom, the boardroom, that was their world. My world was here amidst the flour, sugar, and heat. My war would be fought from my kitchen. My first move was to become a ghost in my own home. I maintained the facade perfectly. I still made Mark's favorite dinners, packed his lunches, and smiled politely through his tedious stories about depositions and mergers. I was the perfect, supportive, useless wife. But after he went to bed, my real life began. I bought a cheap, refurbished laptop with cash from the grocery budget. I started using coupons and buying store brands, pocketing the difference. That extra $50 a week was my seed money, my first secret investment in myself. I started a food blog. I called it The Suburban Secret. It was anonymous, of course. My About Me page was vague, describing a Midwestern home cook rediscovering her family's heritage through recipes. I started photographing my food, using my old DSLR camera that Mark had once bought me as a hobby gift. I watched hours of YouTube tutorials on food styling and lighting, learning to make a simple stew look like a work of art. My first few posts got barely any traffic, a few comments from other aspiring bloggers, but I was meticulous. I wrote not just recipes, but the stories behind them. I wrote about how my grandmother's apple pie was the taste of forgiveness after a family argument, how my father's chili recipe was the smell of a crisp autumn Saturday. I poured all the emotion I couldn't show my husband into my writing. I was telling my story, coded in the language of food. For months, I lived a double life. By day, I was Amelia, the homemaker. By night, I was Eve, the mysterious voice behind the suburban secret, my online persona. I'd stay up until 2 or 3 a.m., writing, editing photos, and engaging with my tiny but growing community of followers. I was exhausted, running on coffee and pure, unadulterated rage, but I also felt more alive than I had in years. The villains of my story, Mark and Karen, remained blissfully ignorant. They were too absorbed in their own self-importance to notice the dark circles under my eyes, or the fact that I was suddenly an expert on search engine optimization. Mark saw a wife who was perhaps a little quieter, a little more tired. Karen saw a sister-in-law who was still, thankfully, a domestic bore. Their arrogance was my shield. They couldn't conceive of me having a life, a plan, or an ambition they didn't know about. In their minds, I was a known quantity, simple, predictable, and utterly dependent. This underestimation became my greatest weapon. Karen, in her own twisted way, even helped me. She was a vice president of marketing, and at family gatherings, she loved to pontificate about branding, engagement, and market penetration. I would sit there, nodding meekly, asking dumb questions, all while soaking up free expert advice. "You have to create a narrative," she'd say, swirling her Chardonnay. "Authenticity is key. People don't just buy a product. They buy a story." I took her words to heart. My blog story became about reclaiming the value of domestic work, of heritage, of food made with love. It was a narrative that resonated with thousands of people who felt overlooked and undervalued in their own lives. My breakthrough came about 6 months in. I posted a recipe for something I called vindication lasagna. It was a rich, complex 7-layer behemoth that took an entire day to make. In the accompanying post, I wrote a thinly veiled story about pouring your frustrations into your cooking, about layering flavors like you're building up your defenses, about creating something beautiful and strong out of anger. I didn't mention Mark or Karen, but I channeled every ounce of my resentment into that post. The post went viral. It was shared on Facebook, then picked up by a major food blogger in Chicago. From there, it exploded. The story, more than the recipe, was what hooked people. Suddenly, the suburban secret had tens of thousands of followers. My inbox was flooded with emails from women sharing their own stories of feeling invisible. The power dynamic began to shift, ever so slightly. The blog started generating a small ad revenue. It wasn't much, maybe a few $100s a month, but it was mine. I opened a bank account online, a secret account that Mark and Karen knew nothing about. Depositing that first check for $237.54 felt more satisfying than any diamond bracelet Mark had ever given me. It was real. It was earned. And it was the start of my war chest. The escalation came faster than I could have imagined. A producer from WGN Morning News in Chicago emailed me, wanting to do a segment on the viral Vindication lasagna and the anonymous blogger behind it. I panicked. Going on television would blow my cover. I politely declined, saying I was intensely private, which only seemed to fuel the mystery and intrigue around Eve. The increased traffic, however, caught the attention of someone else, a literary agent from New York named Sarah. Her email was direct and to the point. Your writing is incredible. Your recipes are divine. The story you're telling is one that needs to be on bookshelves. Have you ever considered writing a cookbook? If so, call me. I stared at the email for a full 10 minutes, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. A cookbook. A real physical book. It was a dream so far beyond what I had allowed myself to imagine that it felt like a hallucination. This was the moment. This was the turning point from a secret hobby into a full-blown offensive. I took a deep breath and started to type my reply. The meeting with Sarah had to be clandestine. I told Mark I was meeting an old college friend for lunch in the city. The lie slipped off my tongue with surprising ease. I took the train from Naperville to Union Station, my hands sweating, clutching a folder with my book proposal. The proposal was my declaration of war. I had poured everything into it: sample chapters, stunning photographs, and a detailed marketing plan I had built using the strategies Karen had so carelessly bragged about. The theme of the book was an extension of my blog, reclaiming the art of home cooking as a source of power and self-worth. I even had a title in mind: The Useless Wife's Table. Sarah was a force of nature, sharp, fast-talking, and brilliant. We met at a quiet corner table at The Gauge, a restaurant across from Millennium Park. She read through my proposal, her expression unreadable. For 20 minutes, the only sounds were the clinking of silverware and the rustle of paper. Finally, she looked up at me, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "This is a 6-figure book deal, Eve," she said, her voice low. "Maybe more. The story is what sells it. The angry, undervalued wife who proves everyone wrong. It's magnificent." A wave of dizziness washed over me. 6 figures. It was a number so large, so life-altering, that I couldn't fully process it. It was freedom. It was power. It was everything they thought I could never have. "I have one condition," I said, my voice shaking slightly but firm. "My anonymity has to be protected until the day the book is published. No one can know who I am, especially my husband." Sarah's smile widened. "Oh, honey," she said, leaning forward. "This isn't just a cookbook, is it? This is a revenge story, and I am going to sell the hell out of it." The train ride home was surreal. I watched the Chicago skyline recede, the glass towers gleaming in the afternoon sun. They looked like fortresses, just like Mark and Karen, but I had found a crack in their walls. I had a secret weapon they knew nothing about. I walked back into my perfect suburban home, the signed agent agreement tucked safely in my purse. Mark was on the couch, watching golf, a drink in his hand. "Hey," he said, not looking up. "How was your friend? What did you guys do?" I looked at him, at his complete and utter lack of curiosity, at his comfortable ignorance. And for the first time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt a surge of pity. "It was fine," I said, my voice even. "We just talked about the future." He just grunted in response, his eyes glued to the screen. He had no idea that my future no longer included him. The next year was a whirlwind of secret activity, a tightly choreographed dance of deception. I was writing a book, recipe testing, and doing photo shoots. Right under Mark's nose. My kitchen, the scene of my initial humiliation, became my production studio. The lies became more elaborate, and my excuses for needing time alone grew more creative. A newfound interest in meditation gave me an hour of solitude each morning. A fictional online book club accounted for my late nights on the laptop. A migraine bought me a full day in my bedroom, which was actually spent on a frantic final editing session with my publisher in New York. My publisher, a prestigious imprint at Penguin Random House, was fully on board with my revenge plot. My editor, a sharp woman named Chloe, found the whole story delicious. "The slow burn is everything, Amelia," she'd tell me over clandestine phone calls I'd take while wandering the aisles of Whole Foods. "The bigger the secret, the more explosive the reveal." The book deal Sarah had promised came through, and it was even better than she'd predicted. The advance was staggering. The moment the first wire transfer hit my secret bank account, I felt a fundamental shift in my own molecular structure. It was the first significant amount of money I had ever earned entirely on my own. I remember staring at the number on my banking app, sitting in my car in a quiet corner of a Target parking lot, and just weeping. Not with sadness, but with a raw, overwhelming sense of relief. It was the sound of my cage door swinging open. I immediately hired a divorce lawyer, one of the best in Chicago, a shark. I found her through a friend of a friend and paid her hefty retainer from my book advance. Our meetings were as secretive as my calls with my publisher. I told Mark I was taking a pottery class at the local arts center. Instead, I was sitting in a high-rise office on Wacker Drive, methodically documenting Mark's financial deception and Karen's emotional abuse. My lawyer, a woman named Ms. Davies, was impressed. "Most of my clients come in here with tears," she said during our first meeting. "You've come in with a balance sheet and a battle plan. He's not going to know what hit him." Meanwhile, Mark and Karen's condescension continued unabated, a steady, toxic drip. They were so secure in their worldview, so certain of my place in it, that they couldn't see the ground crumbling beneath their feet. At a family barbecue that summer, Karen cornered me by the grill. "Amelia, I've been meaning to talk to you," she said, her voice oozing fake concern. "I know a woman who runs a very successful dog-walking business. You love being outside, and it would give you something to do, some pocket money of your own. I could make an introduction?" I just smiled, a serene, placid smile that I had perfected over the past year. "That's so thoughtful of you to think of me, Karen," I said. "But I'm pursuing a few projects of my own right now." Her eyes flickered with annoyance. "A project? What kind of project could I possibly have?" She patted my arm patronizingly. "Well, don't overexert yourself. We wouldn't want you getting overwhelmed." The arrogance was breathtaking. It was also the fuel that kept me going through the 18-hour days of writing, cooking, and plotting. The pre-publication buzz for The Useless Wife's Table was phenomenal. My publisher's marketing team, armed with the irresistible hook of the anonymous Eve, worked magic. They sent out advance copies to major food critics and lifestyle magazines. Good Morning America wanted to book me for a reveal segment on my publication day. People magazine wanted an exclusive interview. The machinery of my revenge was now a massive, unstoppable force, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment to step out from behind the curtain. I chose the setting for the final act with deliberate cinematic care. It had to be Thanksgiving. It had to be in my house. It had to be a perfect echo of that first horrific dinner. But this time, I would be in control. I invited Mark's entire family, his parents, his aunt and uncle, and of course Karen and her bland, sycophantic husband. I spent a week preparing a feast that was nothing short of magnificent. A heritage turkey brined in apple cider, sourdough stuffing with wild mushrooms, cranberry sauce with hints of orange and port, and a dozen other side dishes and desserts. It was the culmination of everything I had learned, a symphony of flavors and textures. It was the last meal I would ever cook in that house. They arrived, filling the house with their loud, self-important chatter. Karen walked in and surveyed the scene, the groaning buffet table, the perfectly set dining room. "My God, Amelia," she said, a hint of grudging admiration in her voice. "You really outdid yourself. It's like a real-life Pinterest board." She meant it as a backhanded compliment, but I just smiled. "I'm glad you like it. I've been working on a few things." We sat down to dinner. The conversation, as always, orbited around them. Mark boasted about a huge case he had won. Karen announced her promotion to senior vice president. They talked about money, power, and status, the holy trinity of their existence. I let them talk, playing the part of the gracious hostess, refilling wine glasses and passing platters of food. I watched them eat my cooking, savoring the irony. They were literally consuming the fruits of the labor they so openly disdained. Finally, as dessert was being served, a trio of pies, including my grandmother's never-fail apple pie, Mark tapped his glass for a toast. "I just want to say," he began, beaming, "how proud I am of this family. To another successful year." Everyone raised their glasses. "To success," Karen echoed, looking pointedly at me, a silent addendum hanging in the air. "Our success." After the toast, there was a lull in the conversation. This was my moment. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and smug satisfaction. It was time to burn it all down. "Actually," I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the chatter, "I have an announcement of my own." Every eye in the room turned to me. It was the first time all night I had commanded their attention. Mark looked at me, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What is it, honey? Did you finally decide to join that book club?" I let his question hang in the air, a perfect little monument to his obliviousness. A faint, indulgent smile touched my lips. "Something like that," I said, my voice as smooth as silk. I rose from my chair and walked over to the sideboard, where a large, cloth-wrapped object was sitting. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. There was no fear, no hesitation, just a profound, icy calm. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 1,000 times. I turned back to face them, my family, the jury that had convicted me without a trial. "For the past year," I began, letting my gaze drift from Mark's confused face to Karen's impatient one. "You've all wondered what I do with my time. You've been so concerned about my lack of contribution." I savored the word, letting it land like a drop of acid. "You called my passion a hobby. You called my work useless. You thought you knew exactly who I was and what I was worth." I paused, letting the silence stretch. Karen shifted in her seat, her expression tightening. She could sense a shift in the power dynamic, even if she couldn't comprehend its source. Mark just looked bewildered, like a dog trying to understand a card trick. "Well," I continued, my voice dropping slightly, "I decided to take your advice. I decided to get serious, to build something of my own." With a slow, deliberate movement, I pulled the cloth off the object on the sideboard. There, in the warm glow of the dining room lights, was a stack of 10 beautiful hardcover books. The cover was a stunning photograph of a rustic, laden table, my table. And across the top, in elegant, bold letters, was the title, "The Useless Wife's Table," by Amelia Sterling. A collective gasp went through the room. Mark's jaw literally dropped. Karen's face, which had been a mask of smug superiority, instantly crumpled into a disbelieving scowl. His parents just stared, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. I picked up a copy and placed it in the center of the table, right next to the remnants of the turkey. "It was released yesterday," I said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "It's currently #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for advice and how-to. It seems a lot of people are interested in what a useless wife has to say." I let them absorb that. I watched the color drain from Mark's face as he stared at my name on the cover. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the book as if it might burn him. "Amelia, what is this?" he stammered. "This is a joke, right?" "Oh, it's very real, Mark," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. Then I delivered the second blow. I reached into the pocket of my apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it and slid it across the table toward him. It was a copy of the royalty statement from my publisher for my first week of sales. The number at the bottom was in the high 6 figures. "That's my earnings," I said, my voice clear and steady. "For 1 week. It's more than you and Karen make in a year, combined." Absolute stunned silence. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Karen snatched the paper from the table, her eyes scanning the numbers, widening in horrified disbelief. She looked from the paper to me, a toxic mix of fury and jealousy twisting her features. You tricked us," she hissed. "I learned from the best," I replied coolly. And then the final, beautiful, crushing blow. "And since I now have a significant income of my own, an income I have been carefully documenting and protecting, I no longer need to be a household and hobby overhead." I directed this last part to Mark, whose face had gone a ghastly shade of white. "Miss Davies, my lawyer will be serving you with divorce papers on Monday morning at your office. I imagine you know her?" She's one of the best. I've already secured a new apartment in the city. The movers are coming tomorrow. I looked around at the stunned faces, the remnants of my magnificent feast now looking like the spoils of a lost war. I had taken the very thing they used to diminish me and turned it into a weapon of mass financial and emotional destruction. You see, I said, my voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. The thing about playing house, Karen, is that the person who runs the house knows where all the secrets are buried. She knows the structural weaknesses. She knows how to make it beautiful, and she knows how to tear it all down. I turned to Mark, who looked utterly broken, a pathetic shell of the powerful man he pretended to be. I hope you enjoyed your dinner, Mark. It's the last one I'll ever be making for you. I then walked out of the dining room, not looking back, leaving them to choke on the ashes of the world they had so carelessly set on fire. I went upstairs, pulled out a suitcase I had packed weeks ago, and walked out the front door, leaving my key on the hall table. I didn't run. I walked, each step feeling lighter than the last, into the crisp, cold Thanksgiving night, a free woman. My new life began in a sun-drenched condo overlooking Lake Michigan. The Chicago skyline, once a symbol of Mark's world, was now my backyard. The transition was brutal for him, just as my lawyer had predicted. The divorce was a bloodbath, but I had the better lawyer and the cleaner hands. My meticulous documentation of his financial control and deception, combined with my now public story of empowerment, made him look like a villain in a melodrama. The press got wind of the story behind the useless wife's table, the anonymous blogger, the condescending husband, the triumphant reveal, and they devoured it. My book sales skyrocketed even further. I was no longer just a cookbook author. I was a symbol. Mark and Karen's pristine suburban world was shattered. The story spread like wildfire through their social and professional circles in Naperville and Chicago. Karen's colleagues in marketing saw her not as a branding genius, but as a petty, jealous bully who had inadvertently created her rival's million-dollar brand story. The irony was not lost on them. She was passed over for a C-suite position she had been coveting for years. The official reason was a strategic restructuring, but the rumor was that her personal brand had become toxic. Mark's firm was a bastion of old-school conservatism. The partners valued appearances above all else. A messy, public divorce where the husband was painted as a manipulative fool was not good for business. He was quietly removed from a major client's account, and his path to a senior partnership, once a certainty, became a dead end. They had built their identities on the foundations of professional success and social standing, and I had dynamited both. They weren't fired, nothing so dramatic. They were just diminished. Their power, which had once seemed so absolute, had been an illusion, fragile and easily broken. They were slowly being suffocated by the consequences of their own cruelty, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. I, on the other hand, was thriving. I did the Good Morning America interview, telling my story with a poise and confidence I never knew I possessed. I launched a successful YouTube channel, a line of high-end cookware, and started development on a television show. My brand was authenticity, and my story was my currency. I rarely thought about them, but about a year after the divorce was finalized, I had one last, unexpected encounter. I was doing a book signing for my second bestseller, Feast of Freedom, at a large Barnes & Noble on Michigan Avenue. The line of people waiting to have their books signed snaked all the way through the store. They were mostly women, and many of them whispered thank you to me, sharing snippets of their own stories, their own struggles with feeling invisible. As the event was winding down, I looked up and saw them standing near the back of the store, partially hidden by a display of travel guides. It was Mark and Karen. They looked ordinary, smaller. The smug confidence had been replaced by a weary resentment. Karen's expensive suit seemed to hang off her, and Mark just looked tired and lost. They weren't there to confront me. They seemed to be there as spectators, drawn to the scene of their own downfall, perhaps trying to understand how the woman they had dismissed as a non-entity had become the main character. Our eyes met for a brief moment across the crowded bookstore. There was no anger in their gaze, no apology. There was just a vast, empty expanse of bewilderment. They still didn't get it. They never would. I gave them a small neutral nod, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. A final closing of a chapter. Then I turned my attention back to the woman in front of me, a young mother with tears in her eyes, who was telling me my first book had given her the courage to start her own business. I signed her book to a fellow architect. Keep building. Mark and Karen slipped out of the store unnoticed. I never saw them again. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm looking out at the endless city lights from my window, I think of that beautiful empty house in Naperville. I think of how small they tried to make me, how they defined my worth by what I failed to contribute to their world. They came to see what a useless woman could build, forgetting I had been the architect of our home all along. The end.